In 1916, the first polio outbreak struck America. Polio was infecting, paralyzing, and killing thousands of people, many of which were children. No cure or prevention had been found until 1952, when Jonas Salk explored a new way to counteract the disease. On April 12, 1955, it was announced that the Salk vaccine was 90% effective in preventing paralytic polio disease. Salk's exploration and research led to the eradication of polio in the United States. In 1916, a devastating polio epidemic struck America, leaving 3,421 infants and toddlers dead in New York City alone. Leaving children either paralyzed or dead, polio became a disease that was feared by all. Polio continued to be a growing fear. It stayed at a steady case rate through the 1920s and 30s, but in the late 1940s, the reported cases of polio continued to grow. Through the early 1950s, polio was becoming unstoppable. Nobody knew how polio was transmitted or how to treat it. Polio affected the muscles around the lungs and caused many polio patients to have trouble breathing. Patients were placed in large iron lungs to regulate their breathing. Iron lungs, invented in 1929, were large metal cylinders patients would lay in, and they were only allowed out to eat lunch. Eventually, the iron lungs were referred to as metal coffins. Polio continued to be a huge threat in America, which had turned into a country living in fear. Parents wouldn't let children go outside in the summer or play with friends. Kids wouldn't go swimming. It was mainly children who were infected, so in response, people started to fear kids. They were terrified to encounter this paralyzing threat. Children were not allowed into certain places. Nobody knew what to do until one man stepped up. This man was Jonas Salk. Jonas Salk was born on October 28, 1914, 2 years before the polio outbreak in New York City. He was the child of 2 Jewish immigrants. Even though Salk's parents never received education themselves, they took much pride in having well-educated children.
Well, my parents were more than supportive. My mother particularly. My mother had no schooling. She came to this country from Russia in 1901. She immediately, as a young girl, began to work in order to help support the family. And she was very ambitious in a sense for her children. She wanted her children to have more than she had, so that she lived in her life and invested her life, lived through her children.
Salk was the first member of his family to attend college. He earned his medical degree at New York University School of Medicine and became a scientist physician. Shortly after his job as a practicing physician, Salk received a research fellowship at the University of Michigan in 1942. His fellowship was to study the influenza virus and to create a vaccine to prevent it. As Salk had heard in years of schooling, it was not possible to create a vaccine without using some sort of inactivated virus to get the body to produce antibodies.
I had an opportunity to spend time, an elective period in my last year at medical school, in a laboratory that was involved in studies on influenza. The influenza virus had just been discovered about a few years before that. And I saw the opportunity at that time to test the question as to whether we could destroy the virus infectivity and still immunize. And so by carefully designed experiments, we found that it was possible to do so.
Salk soon got promoted to the head of epidemiology. Thomas Francis Jr. was Salk's mentor at Michigan School of Public Health, and he taught Salk the process of creating a vaccine. Together, Thomas Francis Jr. and Salk created the first flu vaccination.
I was not trained as a scientist. I was trained in medicine. And so my functioning, you might say, as a medical scientist came through being self-taught, through the experience of investigating the questions that were of interest to me. And I had no formal training as a virologist or as an immunologist, but I learned what I needed to know in order to address those questions.
In 1947, Salk became director of the Virus Research Laboratory at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. When Salk first moved to the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine, he encountered many difficulties. He worried that he had made the wrong choice because his lab was small and it was in the basement of an old hospital. It was littered with old furniture and dust. At this time, Pittsburgh was at the top of the list in the steelmaking industry. The whole city was caked with black soot, including Salk's lab. When Salk had settled into his lab, he was visited by the Director of Research of the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, later known as the March of Dimes Foundation.
Within a few months after I arrived in Pittsburgh, I was visited by the Director of the Research of the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, asking if I would be willing to participate in a program on typing polioviruses. Well, I'd had no experience in working with polio, but this provided me with an opportunity, just as the work on influenza did. And so I seized upon that opportunity. It gave me a chance to get funds, to get laboratory facilities, to get equipment, to hire staff, and to build up something that was not there. It also would provide me with an opportunity to learn about how you work with poliovirus.
Although Salk did not know it at the time, this opportunity that was described would be the influencing factor that allowed him to change the world. Salk worked hard to find a vaccine for this virus. He explored different ways to make the vaccine other than only using a weakened virus to get the body to produce antibodies. This way was not as effective because it still ran the risk of infecting the host. With laboring hours in the lab, Salk finally made the first effective inactivated vaccine that allowed the virus to be injected into the body without infecting the host. As Salk said, "At the time, I was behaving like a medical scientist, exploring the limits within which one could effectively immunize with a non-replicating, non-multiplying virus. Now, it was time to test." At first, Salk tested the vaccine on a small group of children who had previously had polio, but had recovered. These children were called the polio pioneers, and were known all over the country. This meant they already had antibodies against polio. He tested on them because if the vaccine really didn't work and the polio inside of it could still infect the body, these children would be able to protect themselves against it. Salk monitored their antibody count, and the numbers showed that their antibodies were increasing. This was great news. Salk then tested the vaccine on volunteers who had never had polio, including himself, his wife, and his 2 children. No one was infected and their antibodies increased. The Salk vaccine worked. April 12, 1955, Salk's colleague Dr. Francis stood up to announce the success of the Salk vaccine. Scientists and doctors gathered to hear what Francis was going to say. Over hundreds of reporters gathered to hear the vaccine announced. The test showed that the vaccine was 80 to 90% effective in preventing paralytic polio disease. The reporters jumped on this. Headlines were titled, "Victory over polio, polio vaccine works." Shortly after the announcement on April 12, 1955, Salk was swarmed by government officials. They wanted to discuss a nationwide vaccination of school children. Only a few hours after Salk's speech, federal governments licensed drug companies to distribute the vaccine. Many companies already had large sums of the drug pre-made even before the vaccine was announced. Shortly after the vaccine was being distributed, a child that had been vaccinated developed polio. The next day, 5 more vaccinated children came down with polio. Eventually, the numbers grew to 260 people infected. Of these, 11 would die. On May 7, 1955, all polio vaccinations were stopped. Salk was bewildered with the new encounters of polio. The investigation found that all of the infected were given a vaccine created in Qatar laboratories. This was a spoiled batch that contained a live virus. This company was shut down and the vaccine was re-administered. The Salk vaccine continued to work, and by 1961, the number of reported cases was reduced by 90%. The Salk vaccine is still used around the world today, and polio cases are dwindling. Thanks to Salk's exploration and research, polio is now eradicated in the United States.